What if I told you the Roman Empire never truly fell? Not in the way we were taught, not in fire or ruin, but in transformation. A shape-shifting empire that endured for over 1,000 years after the West collapsed. A civilization that spoke Greek, prayed in gold-lit domes, and ruled from a city where Europe met Asia. Byzantium. The name alone carries mystery. Some call it the Eastern Roman Empire. Others see it as something entirely different, a fusion of faith and empire, of sword and scripture, of ancient knowledge and divine ambition. But how did it begin? And how did it last through invasions, plagues, betrayal, and siege after siege? Why did emperors blind their rivals? Why were saints painted on every wall? And how could a city survive with enemies on every side, even as it collapsed from within? We will walk through mountain monasteries where icons were hidden in fear, through ruined battlefields where entire armies vanished, through candlelit libraries that preserved the memory of the ancient world. This is not just a story of rise and fall. It is a journey through identity, belief, survival, and loss. So gather your thoughts, open your senses, and step with me into the shadows of an empire that refused to die. For the past is not behind us, it is beneath us, waiting to be found. The dust still clung to my boots when I first glimpsed it. The hill was steep, and the wind off the Sea of Marmara carried the salt of forgotten centuries. Below me, nestled between the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, the city shimmered in the amber light. They called it Byzantium once, a quiet Greek trading post, but it would become something far greater. I imagined standing beside Constantine the Great on that same ridge. As he looked out over the same waters, his cloak catching the breeze like a banner unfurling. It was here, in the early 4th century, that he made a decision that would reshape the world. Rome had become a crumbling titan, fractured by civil war and internal decay. Constantine saw a new beginning, a rebirth in the East, and so he laid the foundations of Nova Roma, the new Rome. But history had other plans. The name that would endure was not one he gave it, but one that the people would speak for over 1,000 years. Constantinople, the city of Constantine. As I walked through the ruins of the ancient forums, the marble still cold underfoot, I could almost hear the chisels carving imperial decrees into stone. Here, the old world and the new collided. Pagan temples stood beside Christian churches. Latin echoed in Senate halls while Greek prayers filled the air at dusk. The empire was transforming, not dying. The eagle of Rome was not falling. It was learning to fly again, eastward. Byzantium became the bridge, not just between continents, but between ideas. East and West, pagan and Christian, tradition and change. The city was ringed by formidable walls, their foundations rooted in the bones of ancient civilizations. Inside them, emperors would be crowned in halls lit by golden lamps, and priests would raise incense to a god newly enthroned above the old pantheon. Constantine himself embraced Christianity, not just as a private faith, but as the very soul of his empire. The Edict of Milan, issued under his authority, made Christianity not just legal, but central. The persecution of old ended, and in its place came basilicas of marble and light, rising like prayers cast in stone. Still, the old gods lingered in shadowed corners. I found them carved into forgotten niches, half erased but not gone. Rome's spirit was stubborn. Byzantium did not destroy it. It absorbed it, transfigured it, and carried it forward. This was not a clean break, but a metamorphosis. Like a flame passed from one torch to another. As I traced the old aqueducts and roadways, I saw the ambition of this place. Constantine believed the empire could endure, that with new faith and new blood it would rise again. And it did. For over 1,000 years, through siege, plague, and schism, Constantinople held firm, a beacon against the dark. The eagle of Rome, reborn in gold and purple, soared high above these streets. And though the Western Empire would fall to invaders and fade into myth, this city remained, vigilant, defiant. Standing there, I felt it in my bones. This was no mere capital. This was the heart of something vast and visionary, the place where history turned on its axis. The day Constantine raised his standard here, he was not just founding a city. He was lighting a fire that would burn for centuries. The first chapter of Byzantium was written not in conquest, but in vision. A vision that would echo through the halls of emperors, across the domes of cathedrals, and in the silence of stone long after the last banners had fallen. And so, the eagle spread its wings, not over Rome, but over a new dawn. The first thing you notice is the light. Not the harsh blaze of sun on stone, but something deeper, something reflected. Golden tesserae shimmering in dim naves, catching fire with every flicker of a hanging oil lamp. I had entered the Hagia Sophia at dawn, when silence still ruled the vast chamber. The domes above seemed suspended not by stone, but by prayer. This was the dream of Justinian. Emperor, builder, conqueror. It was under his rule in the 6th century that the Byzantine Empire burned brightest, when the old Roman glory seemed not just remembered, but reborn. In those years, the city of Constantinople was more than a capital. It was a symbol, a torch held high in a world slipping toward darkness. Justinian ruled with iron and vision. From the worn marble of the Milian, the empire's zero marker, roads once stretched to Africa, Italy, and beyond. I followed one of those roads east, where his generals had marched. Belisarius, his greatest commander, had reclaimed North Africa from the Vandals and marched on Rome itself. For a time it seemed that the Roman Empire, in all its vastness, had returned. But power came at a cost. The streets beneath my feet still remembered the Nika riots, when half the city burned and tens of thousands were slain in the Hippodrome. Justinian responded not with retreat, but with ambition. He razed the ruined basilica and built something eternal in its place, the Hagia Sophia, a cathedral so vast it defied logic. Some whispered that angels had helped raise it. Others said its dome floated on air. I looked up and understood their awe. But Justinian was not only a builder of monuments, he was a builder of law. His legal code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, was a feat unmatched since the 12 tables of ancient Rome. It codified justice, reorganized chaos, and echoed through the centuries into the very frameworks of modern Europe. I found fragments of that code etched in forgotten courtrooms, inked in dusty margins, quoted in legal doctrines long after the empire fell. He was also a builder of faith. Orthodoxy was his banner, and heresy his enemy. The great theological disputes of the age, Monophysitism, Arianism, Chalcedonian Creed, were not abstract to him. They were matters of empire, life, and death. His was a realm where doctrine and politics walked hand in hand, cloaked in incense and steel. The wealth of the empire poured into the city, silks from China, spices from India, gold from Africa. I walked the remains of the Mise, the grand boulevard of Constantinople, where merchants shouted in dozens of tongues. The empire was not just powerful, it was rich, encrusted with luxury, drenched in ceremony, a place where the emperor did not simply rule, he was seen as the living representative of divine order. Yet beneath the brilliance, shadows stirred. Justinian's wars drained the treasury. His religious rigidity fractured unity. The first great plague struck during his reign, killing by some accounts half the population. I stood in the remains of a churchyard, the stone markers worn smooth, and felt the quiet devastation that numbers cannot capture. Glory and grief, always side by side. Still, Justinian's flame endured. His vision reshaped the empire, gave it its laws, its voice, its splendor. For all its flaws, his age became the high watermark of Byzantine ambition. In the Hagia Sophia, where light dances across golden saints and marble columns, I touched the past not as ruin, but as radiance. I was no longer merely an explorer. I was a witness to the brilliance of a city that dared to claim eternity. For in these stones, the empire did not whisper, it sang. And the fire Justinian lit, it burned still. The wind was sharp in the highlands east of Anatolia. It carried a scent of iron and cold stone, the kind of air that remembers war. I stood near the remnants of Dara, once a proud frontier fortress where the empire's eastern edge clashed with an ancient rival. Beyond that horizon lay Persia, not the fallen empire of Cyrus and Darius, but the Sassanid kings, proud and relentless, who stared across the frontier with equal ambition. To the east and the north, Byzantium was never alone. The empire's golden age did not unfold in peace. It was surrounded, pressed, tested constantly. The Persians were perhaps its oldest adversaries. Two empires with mirrored grandeur locked in a struggle that outlasted kings and generations. Rome and Persia, east against east. The walls of Dara told part of the story. Built in haste, fortified with brilliance, they stood as both shield and signal. Here the Byzantine army met its match. Battles raged under scorching sun and through bitter winters. Victory and loss seesawed across the centuries. I could still feel the weight of tension in the earth, the sense that peace was only a breath away from war. But Persia was not the only shadow rising. In the forests and plains to the north, across the Danube and beyond the Black Sea, new forces stirred. Tribes whose names changed like the wind, but whose threat remained constant. Goths, Slavs, Avars, Huns. Each wave pressed the imperial borders with fury. Each came not for tribute, but for land. The empire responded with walls and watchtowers, treaties and bribes, armies hardened by cold campaigns. I followed the route of the long walls, those ancient fortifications built to protect the outskirts of Constantinople itself. They stretched across the Thracian countryside like a scar. Even here, within reach of the capital, the danger had been real. In the north, the pressure never ceased. The Danube frontier was a line of fire. I found a ruined signal tower where once lights had flared to warn of raiders. The stones were blackened, the watch platform collapsed, but the view, it was still clear. You could see trouble coming from miles away, and yet still never be ready for it. The empire fought these battles in silence and in spectacle, sometimes with swords, sometimes with diplomacy. Emperors paid tribute in gold or offered imperial titles to foreign chieftains, trying to turn foes into friends. But the peace was never permanent. There was always another tribe. another alliance broken, another winter march across frozen rivers. The strain showed, not just in the treasury but in the soul of the empire. The countryside emptied, towns shrank, the burden of defense fell heavier with each campaign. Veterans became farmers, farmers became soldiers. The line between civilian and warrior began to blur. I passed through villages in Anatolia where old field boundaries had become training grounds, where every man bore arms not by choice, but by necessity. And still, the empire held, bent but not broken, defiant even as the horizon darkened. In these frontier lands, I felt the pulse of something ancient and tragic. Byzantium was a fortress civilization. It survived not just by its glory, but by its grit. It endured not only because of emperors or cathedrals, but because of the men and women who watched the hills each night, waiting for the signal fires to rise. This was the edge of empire, a place of perpetual twilight where glory faded into vigilance and peace was never more than a breath from breaking. And in the silence of the walls, I understood. The shadows at the gates were not a flaw, they were a constant, the ever-present challenge that shaped the empire's character. For Byzantium, survival was not granted, it was earned. I lit a candle in the half-dark of a forgotten chapel in Cappadocia. The air smelled of stone dust and old incense, of wax melted by prayers whispered in fear. Around me, the walls still bore their scars, frescoes of saints with gouged eyes, painted halos scraped raw by unseen hands. This was not the damage of time, it was deliberate, a silent war fought in paint and silence, the war of icons. Faith was never quiet in Byzantium. It thundered from cathedral domes and echoed through imperial courts. But in the 8th and 9th centuries, faith did more than guide the empire, it divided it. The question was simple: should images of Christ and the saints be venerated or destroyed? But like all questions in Byzantium, the answers were tangled in politics, power, and fear. The iconoclast controversy, as we call it now, did not begin in a vacuum. The empire had suffered defeats on the battlefield. Earthquakes shook its cities. Plagues returned like ghosts. Some emperors looking for answers saw the veneration of icons as idolatry. They blamed the wrath of God on images that filled every church and home. And so began the Great Purge. I visited a monastery carved into a cliff, its chambers now open to the sky. Once monks here had hidden icons in caves, behind false walls, beneath floorboards. They painted quickly and in secret, knowing discovery meant exile or worse. The state sent soldiers, and the hammers followed. Frescoes were whitewashed, mosaics pried loose, statues burned. But the people resisted. In villages, mothers passed down icons like heirlooms, wrapped in cloth, buried with the dead, smuggled across provinces. The faithful believed these images were not just art, they were bridges to the divine. To destroy them was to sever a lifeline to the sacred, and so faith became rebellion. Empress Irene, a woman of sharp will and sharper memory, called a council in Nicaea to end the strife. She sided with the iconophiles, those who loved the images. Under her rule, the icons returned, but peace was fragile. The pendulum would swing again. Emperors came and went, some breaking the images, others restoring them. The people watched and endured, their beliefs pulled like thread through the eye of a needle. In the end, it was not a single moment that resolved the controversy, but exhaustion, a quiet return to tradition. When the empire could no longer afford division, the images came back. but they bore the weight of those years. I saw icons restored centuries later, saints with faces redrawn, eyes too wide, as if they remembered what had been done to them. The iconoclast controversy left more than ruined art. It left questions about the nature of faith, about the power of an emperor over the spirit, about the line between reverence and heresy. Byzantium survived the turmoil, but it was changed. I stood in the Hagia Sophia once more. Its mosaics gleamed overhead, restored yet restrained. Gold halos caught the dawn like old fire, but I noticed the gaps, spaces where figures once stood, emptied niches. History remembered not just by what remains, but by what is missing. In Byzantium, faith was never still. It pulsed and struggled, shaped by hands both sacred and cruel. And I understood as I stepped out into the light that in this empire, belief was not just a matter of the soul, it was a matter of survival. The wind was dry and hot when I crossed the threshold into what had once been Byzantine Syria. The air smelled of dust and sun-baked stone. Nothing moved in the ruins but shadows and silence. Yet once, this had been the lifeline of an empire, fertile, prosperous, loyal. Now only fragments remained. I walked through what was left of a church in Damascus, columns shattered, arches cracked. But beneath the rubble, I saw traces of mosaic, blue and gold and deep green. Once vibrant, now fading. The church had become a mosque, then a ruin, then a memory. Its transformation told a deeper story, the rise of a new power, a force that moved with conviction and speed. In the 7th century, a fire swept in from the Arabian deserts. The armies of Islam, newly united under the Prophet Muhammad and his successors, surged across the known world, and they moved with a clarity Byzantium had not seen in generations. At Yarmouk, the Byzantine lines broke. I stood on that battlefield, the river long dried to a whisper. It was here that the empire's eastern defenses collapsed, not in a single moment, but in a tide. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, one by one, the provinces fell. These were not fringe territories. They were the grain baskets, the trade hubs, the cultural soul of the Eastern Empire. Their loss was not just strategic, it was spiritual. In Egypt, I traced the outlines of a once great library near Alexandria, a city that had once rivaled Constantinople in learning and wealth. Now, it was under the Crescent. The patriarchs fled, the churches adapted or perished. And yet, amidst the upheaval, life continued. Islamic rule was not always cruel. In some regions, Christians lived and worshipped in relative peace. But the shift was undeniable. The empire no longer held sway over its own lands. Byzantium fought back, of course. Emperors rallied troops. Fleets set sail, fortresses were rebuilt. But the momentum had changed. The Muslim caliphates were young and united, their warriors driven not just by conquest, but by belief. And as Byzantium stumbled under the weight of its own bureaucracy, corruption, and infighting, the caliphates surged forward like a river unbound. One day, I climbed the remnants of the Theodosian walls in Constantinople. From there, I could see the sea glittering under a pale sun. In the 8th century, Muslim fleets had reached this very place. The city was besieged, not once, but twice. Fire ships filled the harbor, siege towers bristled along the land walls, and still the city held. Thanks to Greek fire, thanks to her walls, thanks perhaps to stubborn faith. But it was close, too close. The empire survived, but it was now a different creature, smaller, harder, less Roman and more Byzantine in the truest sense, more inward, more intricate, more guarded. In the east, Islam had carved out a crescent of fire. A civilization was rising with its own scholars, laws, sciences, and saints. And Byzantium, which had once looked eastward for glory, now looked inward to survive. I stood again beneath a crescent moon rising over a former monastery. The call to prayer echoed in the dark. It was haunting, beautiful, and it reminded me that history is never a straight line. Power flows like wind and tide. For Byzantium, the surge of Islam was not the end, but it was the great turning. And empires, they are not undone in a day. They unravel thread by thread until the shape is changed beyond recognition. The morning mist still clung to the hills of Anatolia when I set out along an old Roman road, now broken and worn by time. It led through wheat fields turning gold in the early light, past villages with stone walls patched again and again by rough hands. These were not cities of marble and mosaic. They were outposts of endurance, places where survival was measured in seasons and silence. This was the heart of the Byzantine theme system, the bones of an empire that refused to die. After the great losses to Islam in the 7th century, Byzantium could no longer rely on the wealth of Egypt or the trade of Syria. The empire was wounded, stripped of its richest provinces. What remained had to be hardened, reforged. And so the emperors looked not to the cities but to the land, not to senators but to farmers, not to hired mercenaries but to men who would fight for their own soil. I passed a crumbling stone marker etched with the faded name of a theme, the theme of Opsikion. There were once many like it, carved into the fabric of Anatolia. Themes were more than provinces. They were military zones, economic engines, defensive shields. Each theme had its own army, and each army was made of local men, soldier farmers who worked the land by day and trained for war by dusk. The system was elegant in its simplicity. A man was given land to farm. In return, he pledged to serve in the local militia. This bond of land and duty held the empire together when all else seemed lost. It was not the wealth of palaces that preserved Byzantium, but the rhythm of the seasons, the swing of a sickle, and the strength of a shield. I stopped in a field where wildflowers had overtaken what had once been a military encampment. There, among the stone outlines of barracks, I could still feel the discipline. These were not lavish armies, but they were committed. Each man fought not just for empire, but for home. The themes were also efficient. Local generals called strategoi governed them. They oversaw defense, justice, and tax collection. It created a leaner empire, one less reliant on distant bureaucracy, one rooted in the realities of terrain and threat. The soldier-farmer knew the land, the passes, the rhythms of the enemy. He could vanish into the hills and strike where needed. It was not grand warfare, it was survival. And yet, over time, even this system began to fray. The growing power of local magnates, the increasing reliance on professional troops, and the loss of land to aristocrats weakened the very backbone of the themes. Peasant soldiers were driven off their fields, service was bought out or avoided, and with each passing generation, the themes that had once protected the empire began to thin. I spoke with an old farmer near the ruins of Amorium who told stories passed down from his grandfather. Stories of when the land was defended by its own, when the emperor was not a distant figure in silk, but a name spoken with pride by men who marched in his name. There was a sadness in his voice, a longing for a time when Byzantium was not just defended, but believed in. As I walked on, the road crumbling beneath my steps, I realized the soldier farmer was more than a figure of history. He was a symbol of resilience, of loyalty, of a civilization that knew its greatest strength was not in conquest, but in holding the line. For in those fields among the wheat and ash, the empire dug in its heels and said, "We remain." The morning sun lit the marble facades of Constantinople with a softness I had never seen before. There was a quiet strength in the way the city held itself now. Not defiant, not desperate, but steady, focused. Something had changed. I had come to trace the rise of a dynasty born not in silk-draped palaces, but in the rugged hills of Macedonia. And it was here, under the Macedonian emperors, that Byzantium remembered how to breathe. The 9th and 10th centuries brought more than just survival. They brought revival. After centuries of contraction and crisis, the empire was beginning to look outward again. The Macedonian dynasty, beginning with Basil I, carved a new path, one of order, of reconquest, of light returning to old halls. I walked the corridors of the great palace where imperial footsteps once echoed with purpose. Basil was a man of rough beginnings, possibly a stable hand, certainly an outsider. Yet through skill, charm, and bold alliances, he claimed the throne. His reign marked the beginning of a transformation, not of instant glory, but of careful restoration. Law was reformed, the military reorganized. The themes, though no longer what they once were, found new discipline, and the empire began to push back. On the eastern frontiers, Arab raids were repelled, fortresses rebuilt, cities reclaimed. I followed the old Roman road east to the ruins of Melitene, once taken by invaders, now restored by Basil's successors. Under Leo the Wise and Constantine VII, learning flourished. The military was refined. The balance of court and countryside regained a fragile peace. This was an empire that had remembered how to stand tall. But it was under Basil II, known as the Bulgar Slayer, that the revival reached its peak. His reign was long, nearly 50 years, and it was marked by relentless focus. Basil had no taste for luxury, no interest in court intrigue. He lived as a soldier emperor, riding into battle, commanding from the front. His greatest campaign was against the Bulgarians, a fierce and proud people who had long been a thorn in the empire's side. I stood on the heights overlooking the pass of Kleidion, where Basil crushed the Bulgarian army. The battle was brutal, the aftermath legendary. It is said that Basil blinded thousands of captured soldiers, sending them back in groups of 100, each led by a man with one eye left to guide the others. When the Bulgarian Tsar saw them, he died of shock. Cruelty, yes, but also calculation. In those days, mercy was weakness, and the empire could not afford weakness. Basil's victories secured the Balkans, opened trade routes, and restored imperial pride. The treasury overflowed, the borders held, and inside the capital mosaics glittered again. Icons returned to their altars. Scholars copied ancient texts by lamplight. This was not just a military renaissance, it was a cultural one. I wandered the library of the Patriarchate, where scribes once preserved the wisdom of Aristotle, Galen, and Homer. Greek learning, filtered through centuries, reawakened in quiet rooms. The empire was no longer just a guardian of tradition. It had become a creator once more. But even in this golden moment, shadows lingered. Basil left no heirs. and with his death the old cracks began to return. Power slipped back into the hands of courtiers. The army softened. The unity he forged began to unravel. Still, for one breath in time, Byzantium had soared again. Not just survived, but flourished. In the Macedonian Renaissance, I saw the empire not as a ghost of Rome, but as a world of its own, fierce, bright, enduring, and for once, the future had seemed wide open. The harbor was alive when I arrived at the Golden Horn. The scent of salt and spice hung thick in the morning air. Ships rocked gently beside the docks, their sails heavy with dew. Voices rose in dozens of languages: Greek, Arabic, Latin, Armenian, Slavic, blending into a music of movement and exchange. This was no ordinary port. It was a gateway, a meeting place of worlds. Constantinople was not just the heart of an empire, it was the navel of the world. Byzantium lived at the intersection of continents and cultures. To the west, the Latin kingdoms. To the east, the Persian plateau and the distant realms of India and China. To the north, the steppes of the Slavs and the Rus. And to the south, the vast richness of the Islamic caliphates. Everything passed through this city. Ideas, goods, beliefs, gold. I walked the old route of the Missae, the main thoroughfare that cut through the capital. It pulsed like an artery from the gates to the palace. Along its edges stood merchants from every corner of the known world. Here, a silk seller from Syria laid out dyed fabrics like river water. There, a trader from Venice bartered for spices wrapped in thick wool. I even saw coins stamped with Arabic script used in Christian markets. The walls might have been guarded, but the marketplace was open. And it was not just commerce that flowed, knowledge did too. In the monastic libraries, Greek texts were preserved with aching care. I held a copy of a 10th century translation of Galen's medical teachings, its margins annotated in 3 languages. The empire had become a keeper of memory, a guardian of what had come before. Byzantine scholars did not only copy, they commented, they argued, they refined, they translated Persian and Arabic works into Greek. They transmitted ancient knowledge to the West through Italy and beyond. Without Byzantium, the wisdom of antiquity might have vanished in fire and forgetfulness. I stood in the shadow of the Magnora School, once a center of higher learning beside the Great Palace. Here, philosophy and astronomy were debated beside the study of Scripture. Students came from all over the empire to learn beneath mosaic ceilings and the watchful gaze of saints. It was a different kind of power, not military, not political, but intellectual, the kind that outlives kings. And always there was silk. The story goes that 2 monks traveling from the east smuggled silkworm eggs back to Constantinople in hollowed-out walking sticks. Whether myth or truth, the result was the same. Byzantium broke China's monopoly. Imperial silk workshops were established. Patterns became more elaborate, colors more symbolic. Purple, reserved only for the emperor, shimmered like starlight in candlelit halls. Silk became currency, diplomacy, identity, a language spoken without words. In one transaction, I read that 1,000 bolts of Byzantine silk were offered to a northern ruler in exchange for peace. It was not just fabric, it was power woven into cloth. Trade, letters, silk, they made Byzantium more than a state. They made it a civilization, not isolated, but interconnected, not stagnant, but evolving. A place where East met West not in war, but in conversation. As I stood on the Galata Tower, watching ships fade into the horizon, I felt the weight of it. The city was not only rich in gold and grain, it was rich in memory, in meaning. For all its battles, all its struggles, Byzantium's greatest strength was always this: the ability to connect, to gather the world in its arms and hold it, even for a while. The mountains of eastern Anatolia rose like teeth against the horizon. Cold winds swept across the high plains, and the sky seemed to hang heavy with memory. I stood near the ancient fields of Manzikert, where the earth itself still felt tense, as if holding on to the echo of hooves, shouts, and steel. This was where everything changed. In the year we now call 1071, the Byzantine Empire met the Seljuk Turks in a battle that would fracture its spine. The emperor was Romanos IV Diogenes, a man of ambition who sought to reassert imperial strength across the eastern frontier. But what he encountered on these plains was not a mere incursion, it was a storm. The Seljuks, led by Alp Arslan, were fast and unfamiliar. They fought like ghosts, riding in loose formations, feigning retreat, encircling their prey. The Byzantines were disciplined, well-armored, and slow to adapt. At Manzikert, they were also divided. Political factions back in Constantinople had already begun to plot against Romanos, and in the chaos of battle, betrayal struck. Part of the army fled. Romanos himself was captured. I stood where it may have happened, beneath a patch of wind-bent grass, and imagined the moment when the Emperor of Byzantium knelt before a foreign king. Alp Arslan treated him with surprising courtesy, but it did not matter. The damage was done. The defeat at Manzikert was not simply a military loss. It was the breaking of a dam. In the years that followed, Turkish tribes flooded into Anatolia. Cities that had been part of the empire for centuries fell. The Great Plateau, once the breadbasket and recruiting ground of Byzantium, slipped away like sand through a broken urn. I walked through the ruins of old Cappadocian towns, where churches carved into rock now stood open to the sky, their frescoes faded, their floors covered in dust. These had once been centers of Christian life. Now they lay forgotten, the villagers long gone or absorbed into new ways of life. The theme system, already weakened, could not hold. The soldier farmers, once the backbone of the empire, were overwhelmed or displaced. New lords took their place. The Byzantines, pushed to the coasts and mountains, began to lose not just land, but identity. Manzikert did not destroy the empire overnight, but it marked the turning of the tide, the moment when Byzantium ceased to be the dominant power in Anatolia. From that point on, the empire was on the defensive, scrambling to hold what remained. The civil wars that followed the battle only deepened the wound. Emperors rose and fell in quick succession, each one weaker than the last. The army fractured, the treasury bled. And while the empire fought itself, the Seljuks pressed forward, founding the Sultanate of Rum in the very heart of what had once been imperial land. I found a mosque built on the remains of a former Byzantine fortress. The architecture was different, yet familiar. Stones repurposed, arches retained. The past was not erased. It was layered, one world placed atop another. In the end, Manzikert was not just a battlefield. It was a hinge in time, a place where the weight of history shifted. The eagle of Byzantium, once soaring, had begun to falter. And as I stood alone in the wind, I realized that empires do not always fall with thunder. Sometimes they turn slowly. One decision, one betrayal, one battle. And then the world is never the same. The waters of the Golden Horn were still the morning I arrived, reflecting the broken skyline of old Constantinople. The towers, once proud and bright, stood cracked and darkened. Birds circled over collapsed roofs. Silence settled over the city like ash. It was hard to imagine that this place, this jewel of empire, had once been taken not by Saracens or Persians, but by fellow Christians. In the year we now call 1204, the Fourth Crusade changed everything. It had not been meant to. The knights who gathered in Venice were bound for the Holy Land, drawn by vows, greed, and fire. But debts were owed. Politics interfered, and before long, their destination shifted. They came to Constantinople not as pilgrims, but as wolves. The emperor at the time was Alexios IV, a man who had promised gold and allegiance to the Crusaders in return for his throne. Desperate to reclaim power from his rival, he opened the gates to those who would destroy him. When the gold ran out, so did their patience. I walked the length of the old sea walls where the Crusaders launched their assault. What began as negotiation ended in flame. Their ships crashed into the harbor. Siege engines hammered at the gates. The defenders fought with Greek fire and desperation, but they were too few, too divided. In the chaos of betrayal, the city fell. What followed was no mere occupation. It was a catastrophe. Churches were looted, mosaics torn from the walls, holy relics stolen, broken, or sold. The Hagia Sophia, once the most sacred space in Christendom, was desecrated. Crusaders rode their horses through its marble halls. A prostitute was set upon the patriarch's throne. Gold was melted. Icons shattered. Manuscripts burned. I stood in the ruins of a chapel near the Blachernae Palace. The walls bore signs of fire. The altar had been stripped. Yet above the doorway, one icon remained, half scorched, one eye missing, but still watching. It was a survivor, like the city itself. The sack lasted 3 days. By the end, Constantinople was no longer the center of the Orthodox world. It was a carcass picked clean by allies who had once prayed to the same God. The Latin Empire was declared, but it was no true empire. It was a shadow, a puppet, and it would not last. The Byzantines, scattered and humiliated, formed new states in exile: Nicaea, Epirus, Trebizond. In time they would return. In time they would retake the city. But something had changed forever. I climbed the old hill to the monastery of the Pantocrator, once a place of learning and healing. There, I met a monk who spoke of the sack not in anger, but in sorrow. The empire, he said, had suffered many enemies, but betrayal from within the faith cut deepest. The Crusaders had claimed to fight for Christ, but what they left behind was ruin. And yet, the city endured. In 1261, the Byzantines reclaimed their capital, but it was not the same Constantinople. The treasury was empty. The walls were damaged. The spirit of empire, once unshakable, had grown brittle. Crusaders' swords had done what centuries of siege could not. They had broken the heart of Byzantium from the inside. As I looked across the city at dusk, I saw towers rising in repair. Bells rang once more. Smoke curled from the chimneys. Life had returned. But beneath it all, the cracks remained. The empire would never again rise as it once had. The golden age was over, and the scars of betrayal ran deeper than stone. The wind through the ruins of Nicaea carried a strange stillness, not the silence of death, but of waiting, of exile. This city, once a provincial stronghold, had become a sanctuary after the fall of Constantinople in 1204. Here, in the shadow of catastrophe, the empire refused to vanish. After the sack by the Fourth Crusade, the Byzantine world did not end. It fractured. From the shattered core, new states emerged. Each claimed to carry the true flame of Rome. Each wore the mask of empire. None could fully restore it. In the west, the despotate of Epirus guarded the mountains and plains of Greece, proud, isolated, always suspicious of rivals. In the far east, nestled between mountain and sea, the empire of Trebizond carved out a realm of its own. It glittered briefly, like a jewel cut too fine for its setting. But it was in Nicaea that the closest echo of Constantinople beat. I walked the city's old walls, still sturdy after centuries of war. Within them, emperors in exile held court. Not in gold and marble, but in stone and candlelight. They continued the rites, they trained the army, they copied the old laws. There was no grandeur, but there was memory. The emperors of Nicaea, like Theodore Lascaris and John Vatatzes, were not merely caretakers, they were rebuilders. Slowly, methodically, they recovered lost lands in western Anatolia. They restored order. They negotiated with Latin powers and Orthodox leaders alike. It was not glory, but it was survival. Still, these efforts could not hide the truth. The Byzantine world had become a mosaic of ambitions. The claim to the throne was no longer singular. It was a contest. And each claimant, whether in Epirus, Nicaea, or Trebizond, saw himself as the true heir. I visited a monastery high in the Pindus Mountains, where a faded fresco showed 3 emperors kneeling before Christ, each cloaked in imperial purple, each with different crowns. The artist, anonymous and tired, had tried to make sense of the chaos. The image was not reverence, it was resignation. The Latin occupiers in Constantinople grew weak with time. Their empire was never loved by the people. Their control barely extended beyond the walls. And when Michael VIII Palaiologos of Nicaea recaptured the city in 1261, it seemed the empire had returned. But it was not the same empire. It was smaller, more fragile, surrounded by enemies and drained by civil conflict. Michael's restoration was celebrated, but it brought with it fresh tensions. Those loyal to the other claimants did not disappear. Instead, they withdrew, waiting, whispering. I spoke with a historian in Thessaloniki who described the period after the restoration not as a rebirth, but as a long dusk. The throne was restored, but the light that once shone from it was dim. The emperor no longer commanded all the lands of Byzantium. The church no longer spoke with one voice, and the people, weary from decades of war, now faced new burdens. Rump states still clung to the edges. Trebizond remained independent. Epirus simmered with unrest. The unity of old was gone, replaced by uneasy alliances and fragile treaties. The thrones had multiplied, but the power behind them had faded. As I stood beneath the stars, the moon reflecting off the calm waters of a forgotten harbor, I felt it clearly. The empire was no longer a colossus. It was a memory kept alive by will and tradition, a flickering lamp in the dark. And while the crown still gleamed in the great palace, its light no longer reached the far corners of the world it once ruled. The stones of Constantinople no longer gleamed. They sagged with time, cracked with neglect, and whispered of things once held strong, now left to ruin. I walked beneath the shadow of the Theodosian walls, once the unbreakable skin of an empire, now chipped and sagging. Ivy curled through their seams, moss stained their base. The greatest defenses of Christendom had become a memory of strength, not its proof. By the 14th century, Byzantium was not only shrinking in territory, it was unraveling from within. The emperor still sat on his throne, but his word reached fewer ears. His treasury held more dust than coin, and the empire, once a giant, had become a ghost in royal garments. I traced the stories written in the cracks of the city, stories of hunger, of disease, of fear that moved from house to house with no warning. The Black Death came in waves, not once but many times. Ships carried it, markets spread it, and by the time it took hold, there was no defense. Streets emptied, bells tolled day and night, whole families vanished behind bolted doors, and still the rats moved through the alleys. I met an old man near the cisterns who recited a prayer once used to drive the sickness away. His voice trembled, not from age, but from memory. His grandfather, he said, had buried 6 children in a single season. They had died without sacraments, without farewell. The plague did not care for titles or piety. It took emperors and beggars alike. And when the fields failed, the hunger came. Famine struck in tandem with disease. Crops withered under strange skies. Floods ruined the harvest. War cut supply lines. The city that had once fed armies now starved within its own walls. I walked through an abandoned market square where weeds grew between the paving stones. In one corner, a faded inscription warned against hoarding grain. But there was no grain left to guard. The empire's decline was not just physical, it was spiritual. Monasteries closed, processions grew smaller, icons faded from neglect. The clergy argued while the people prayed to saints who no longer answered, and worse still, civil war. I climbed a tower once used as a watch post during the conflict between John V Paleologos and his rivals. In those years, Byzantines fought Byzantines. Nephews rose against uncles. Generals against emperors. Cities changed sides not out of loyalty, but out of desperation. Mercenaries roamed freely, paid in promises, looting as they marched. Every rebellion weakened the whole. Every siege drained what little remained. I stood before the Blackernay Gate, once the proud northern entrance to the city, and saw a symbol of what had been lost. Rust had taken the hinges. The towers above sagged with the weight of years. The enemy no longer had to break the empire. It was breaking itself. And yet, people endured. Children still played near fountains. Candles still burned before icons. Songs were still sung on feast days, though they echoed through thinner crowds. There was courage in that. Not triumph, but persistence. Byzantium in these years was no longer the empire of Justinian. It was not even the revival of Basil. It was a city and its people holding on against the wind, patching old walls, saying old prayers, and hoping the worst had passed. But the horizon told a different story. New banners stirred in the distance, stronger forces were rising. And the old walls, once the guardians of the world, were tired, very tired. The first time I saw the plains outside Constantinople, the wind was quiet. The grasses waved gently, as if unaware of the storms that had passed through them. But the soil knew. Beneath my feet, buried deep in the earth, were the traces of camps, trenches, and the heavy march of armies. This was the path the Ottomans had taken, a slow, relentless advance, not in a single charge, but in a tightening noose. By the late 14th century, the Empire of Byzantium had become a city with a crown. Its outer provinces were gone, its alliances frayed. and across the Bosphorus, the rising star of the Ottoman Turks grew brighter by the year. I stood at the edge of the Sea of Marmara and watched the waters shift under a pale sky. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the sultans had begun their journey. Osman, Orhan, Murad. Names once distant, now carved into the stones of captured cities. The Ottomans were not like the nomadic raiders of old. They were builders, strategists, masters of siege and statecraft, and they came not as a tide, but as a rising tide wall, swallowing coast and mountain alike. City by city, fortress by fortress, the old Byzantine world was consumed. Adrianople, Thessaloniki, Nicomedia. Each one fell. I walked their streets and saw Ottoman architecture blending with Byzantine stone, a minaret beside a broken dome, Arabic script etched next to worn Greek icons. The change was not instant, but it was final. The empire did not go quietly. Diplomats crossed borders, treaties were signed, marriages arranged, emperors pleaded for help from the West, from Rome, from France, even from distant England. Sometimes help came, most often it did not. Crusades were called, but they came too late, or ended in disaster, and still the Ottomans closed in. In Constantinople, I visited the palace where the last emperors ruled. Rooms once filled with gold and silk now held dust and echoes. The Palaiologos dynasty, noble and weary, did what it could. They repaired the walls, they trained what soldiers remained. But there were fewer coins, fewer allies, and across the straits, the Crescent rose higher. By the time of Sultan Murad II, the Ottomans had already tested the city. They laid siege more than once, probing the walls, learning their shape and rhythm. They knew where the cracks were, where the defenders gathered. The siege was not only physical, it was psychological. The empire knew the end was approaching. The only question was when. I climbed the Yedikule fortress, built later by the conquerors, but standing now as a symbol of what was coming. The Ottomans were not just conquerors, they were heirs. They understood the value of Constantinople, its history, its symbolism. It was the gateway to Europe, the key to legitimacy, and they would not stop until it was theirs. Inside a small chapel near the city's heart, I found a mosaic of Christ Pantocrator, the ruler of all. The face was chipped, the gold flaking, but the eyes still watched, still waited. The people of the city had not abandoned hope. They held processions, they fasted, they prayed for deliverance. But the world had changed. The Ottomans had cannons, trained armies, unity. The Byzantines had walls and faith. And both sides knew that when the final siege came, it would not be like the others. As the sun dipped low behind the city, casting long shadows over the land, I felt the weight of it. The last twilight of Byzantium was near, and the shadow at its gates no longer needed to wait. It had come to claim the final crown. The library was silent except for the turning of pages. The air smelled of leather bindings and candle wax. I sat beneath a flickering lamp, tracing the faded ink of a manuscript copied over 1,000 years ago. It was a portion of Justinian's Code, the great legal work that had once governed an empire. And though the empire itself had long vanished, its words still held power. Byzantium may have fallen in stone and sword, but it endured in thought. Its laws, its art, its very way of seeing the world had shaped everything that followed, and that perhaps is the strangest thing about an empire. It can die and yet never leave. I walked the corridors of an Orthodox church in Thessaloniki, where the walls shimmered with gold and indigo. Mosaics of saints stared from high domes, their gazes eternal. The art was unmistakably Byzantine, not concerned with realism, but with presence. Icons were not portraits, they were windows, glimpses of the divine. In every brushstroke there was theology. In every image, a story, a connection between the visible and the unseen. This art traveled with the faith it served, across the Slavic lands, into Russia, through the Balkans. The Byzantine icon became a symbol of the sacred in all its stillness and strength. And then there was the law. Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis had begun as an attempt to tidy up Roman law, to gather and preserve. But it became something more, a foundation. Centuries later, it would inspire medieval European legal systems. It would shape the codes of Napoleon. Even in modern civil law, its fingerprints remain. I visited a university in Bologna where scholars in the 12th century had once pored over Latin translations of that code. They called it the revival of Roman law. But in truth, it was the echo of Byzantium still speaking across the centuries. Language, too, carried legacy. Greek, refined in the court of emperors, became the liturgical tongue of the Orthodox Church. Even as Latin ruled in the West, Greek preserved the rhythms of Homer, Plato, and the Gospels. It was the language of theology, of diplomacy, of song. I listened to a choir rehearse a Byzantine chant in a chapel high on Mount Athos. The notes rose like incense, slow, layered, haunting, not meant to stir the blood, but to still it. Byzantine identity was never simple. It was Roman in name, Greek in language, Christian in soul. A mosaic of traditions woven into something entirely its own. That complexity, far from weakening it, gave it depth, a resilience that outlived its armies. I stood at the edge of a village festival in northern Macedonia. Children danced in circles to songs passed down through generations. Women carried icons draped in silk. The elders recited prayers with hands worn from years of work. And in that moment, I saw it clearly. The empire had ended, yes, but the idea of Byzantium had not. It lived in ritual, in memory, in rhythm and law and light. Empires crumble, capitals fall, but identity can echo far beyond the grave. As I left the church and stepped into the soft glow of twilight, I thought about the strange persistence of memory, how a law code written 15 centuries ago could still guide justice, how an icon painted in a crumbling cell could still move a heart to silence. And I realized something simple, something powerful. Byzantium never truly disappeared. It just changed form and waited to be remembered. The stars were already rising by the time I left the old city behind. A soft wind moved through the grasses outside the broken gates. Somewhere far behind me, the domes of Constantinople glimmered in the last light. I stopped and looked back, not with sorrow, not with awe, but with quiet understanding. I had come to trace a fallen empire, to touch its stones, to listen for echoes. And what I found was more than ruin, more than glory. I found a promise. Byzantium was never easy to define. It was both Roman and Greek, sacred and imperial, Eastern in its mysticism and Western in its law. It fought with fire and faith. It stood against waves of invasion, plague, and betrayal. And in the end, it fell. But not like a tree cut down. It fell like a mountain eroded by time, its pieces scattered into the world. In the mosaics of Venice, I saw its shimmer. In the chants of Orthodox monasteries, I heard its breath. In the laws of modern courts and the domes of distant cathedrals, I glimpsed its shadow. Empires do not vanish, they transform. I sat beside a small village shrine where a candle flickered before an icon so old the paint had begun to fade into the wood. A woman passed by and nodded. She did not know the names of the emperors. She had never studied the codes of Justinian or the battles of Basil. But the light still burned, the ritual remained. And that is what Byzantium left us. Not just its stories or stones, but its rhythm, a way of walking through time with memory and meaning. In the end, I did not come to Byzantium to find answers. I came to ask better questions. What survives after empires fall? What is strength, if not the ability to endure in silence? What do we carry from those who came before, not in their triumphs, but in their ruins? I crossed the old bridge near Edirne, its arches still holding after centuries of flood and frost, and as I walked, I imagined the footsteps that had come before mine: soldiers, merchants, monks, exiles, explorers, each one carrying pieces of an empire that still speaks through them. This journey was never about the past. It was about what the past leaves behind in us. The explorer's promise is not to discover and forget. It is to carry the story forward, to remember when others do not, to see the cracks, not as endings, but as invitations. I closed my journal beside a dying fire. The page was full, but the story was not finished. Byzantium waits in libraries and ruins, in songs and rituals, in the questions whispered beneath domes and across forgotten thresholds. It is not just history, it is legacy. And so we move forward, step by step, gate by gate, fragment by fragment, not to mourn the fall, but to follow its light. For in the end, Byzantium was never only a place, it was a journey. And you, explorer, are now part of it. The fire is low now, the map is rolled, the ink dried. My pack rests at my side, heavier with memory than with tools. And as the night deepens around me, I sit in the stillness and think of what Byzantium truly was. Not just an empire of soldiers and emperors, not only a string of dates and ruins, it was a long breath in history. A moment stretched across 1,000 years. A light that flickered, faltered, but never fully went out. I remember the worn stones beneath my boots, the chants echoing in ancient halls, the scent of dust in the high libraries, and the gold shimmer of mosaics untouched by time. Every step brought me closer not just to the past, but to the questions it leaves behind. What makes a civilization endure? Is it power or wisdom? Is it conquest or the quiet persistence of belief? Byzantium answered in silence. It endured through faith and form, through ritual and resilience. And when it fell, it did not vanish. It scattered into the winds of history. Pieces of it drifted into law, into language, into art, into prayer. That is what stays with me. Not the grandeur, but the continuity. The way a song sung in a mountain chapel still echoes the liturgies of emperors. The way justice today still leans on codes written in dim candlelight. The way a forgotten empire still speaks, if you know how to listen. This journey may end here, beneath the stars, but the trail does not. Other cities wait, other voices call, and the past is never far behind us. It lingers in stone, in shadow, in the hush before the dawn. So take the story with you. Let it settle in your mind like dust in the corners of an old map. For history does not whisper, it waits. And the next door we open may reveal a world we never imagined.